Patience is easy until your life gets disrupted. Being at peace is effortless as long as life is going your way. It can even take some of the smallest things. Like the other day, I got up real early and I had to get a gallon of milk. So I drive down to the head store, just down the street. And what I realized when I pull up in front of the store is that for the third time in a row, I've forgotten my mask. And so I have to go down to the little triangle at the end of Drift Road, turn around, go back, grab my mask, come back and grab the milk. Small thing, but it can be aggravating. It's amazing how easily we can lose patience. It also especially happens with big things. What if you're facing unemployment? You're not sure where you're going to get a job. You're not sure where your income's going to be. How easy is it to be patient then? Or how about if you have a loved one who's sick in a nursing home or in a hospital and you can't go see them? Or you're at church or you're with your family and you can't hug them. You see, it's easy to be patient when we're able to enjoy the things we take for granted. But when life is disrupted, patience is incredibly difficult. And that's exactly the situation that James is writing into. He is writing to a community whose lives had been severely disrupted. First of all, the crops had failed in their area. There was a famine. Food was scarce. Prices were high. People were poor. The rich were foreclosing on their fields, on their homes, taking advantage of them. They were wondering where their next meal was going to come from. They knew what hunger actually felt like. At the same time, they were struggling with persecution because even though all of them had grown up as good Jewish people, as followers of Christ, they were beginning to be pushed out of the synagogue, and some of them were even being arrested, and some of them were even being beaten, and some were even being killed. And into that situation, James writes this. What are they supposed to do in the middle of this? He writes this in James chapter 5, verse 7. Be patient then, brothers. How long? Until the Lord's coming. Not be patient for a week or for a year, but until the Lord's coming. And when you stop and think about it, he wrote this 2,000 years ago. Which means that we've been waiting for 2,000 years for the coming of Jesus Christ, and he still hasn't shown up, and this command is still for us. Be patient. Chances are most of us will die before we see Jesus return. So basically what James is telling us is be patient for the rest of your life. That's the core of the Christian life. And for some of us, and I would say for most of us, this call to being patient is probably even more difficult than it was for James's community. Not that our struggles are more severe than theirs were, but just because of the air we breathe, the culture we live with, the things that we've come to expect as normal. For instance, for hundreds of years in our country here, people who look like us and talk like us and especially believe like us were the dominant political force in this country. We came to expect that we were in the majority, that we basically, we felt peace because we felt like we were in control. But that has been changing drastically in the last 2 or 3 decades. And most likely, we are going to be in the minority going forward. And we struggle with that because we assume that being in power and being in control was actually what was supposed to be normal. And so when we want things to go back to normal, often we're saying we want things to go back to us being in control. But God's calling us to be patient because us being in control of the world is not normal. But the problem is that sometimes we come to expect it so that we feel entitled to it. It reminds me of this story that happened to the prophet Jonah. There's a scene towards the end of the book where, long story, but you can read it on your own. He goes outside the city of Nineveh, the city of his enemies, and he sits out on a mountaintop, on a hillside, waiting for God to rain down fire on the city. And it doesn't happen. And he's sitting out in the hot sun, And God has compassion on Jonah, and he allows this vine to grow up and over him. And he enjoys the shade that God has provided for him. But the next day, God kills the vine and takes it away. And Jonah is furious with God. Rather than being grateful that he enjoyed a day of shade that God had given him, which he didn't deserve, he felt entitled to it. And so often when we become so used to things, when we take them so for granted, when they're entitled, we get impatient because we think we're owed these things. We're also undone by our technology as well. So if you want to watch a movie tonight, it used to be that you had to drive to Blockbuster, and you might have to explain to your kids what Blockbuster is. But tonight, you just hit a few buttons on your phone or on your computer, and you can stream any movie you want. You don't have to wait. You need directions? You don't have to stop and ask someone for directions. You can pull it up on your phone. Everything that we have come to expect, that everything we want, we can have at our fingertips and have it right now. You're bored, you're sitting in the doctor's office, you can pull out your cell phone and check your status on Facebook or Instagram. Or you can text someone, but you never have to be bored. You have instant entertainment available to you 24/7. We expect it all right here, right now. It's really hard for us to be patient, especially when we consider that the things that we have and the habits that we practice shape what we believe. And we've come to believe that everything that is good, we expect to have it right here, right now. And yet, James is calling us to be patient until the return of Jesus Christ. Or the last thing, we live in a culture of addiction, which means that I will sacrifice my future in order to have immediate and temporary relief, even though it's going to cost me, even though it's going to cost my family in the future. We do this through either drugs or alcohol, but all of us, regardless of whether or not that is our particular struggle, we all have addictive personalities, and we bring that addictive personality into our spirituality. You see, the Christian life is a long marathon of struggle. That's what is all over the New Testament. But we expect Christianity to be a sprint of hair-blowing experience after hair-blowing experience. But it's a long, patient wait. It's a long wait of endurance. And so James is telling us, be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. And instead of demanding that things come right now, he actually points us to an example. And the example is that of a farmer. Have to admit, I don't know a whole lot about farming. I grew up in the city, didn't know too many farmers except for my uncle. But basically, this is what their experience was. A farmer plowed the field, preparing the soil. He planted seeds. But by and large, he sometimes pulled weeds in order to give space for that seed to grow. But by and large, he waited. Here's how James describes it in chapter 5, verse 8. He says, in verse 7, he says, be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. To be a farmer is to be patient, is to wait. You got to wait for the seed to sprout. And then in that part of the world, you needed the rains to come right after the planting, which was in the fall. And then you needed rain to come right before the harvest, which was in the spring. And you know what? You didn't have control over that. In fact, in James's days, there were harvests where the rains did not come, and the food was scarce. You see, because at the heart of patience is not only waiting, but as every farmer knows, patience is about being at peace with the things that you cannot control. Just as the farmer cannot control when that seed sprouts from the ground, or whether or not the rains will fall at the right time, so also we live in a world that we do not control. And the patience that God calls us to until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ is to be at peace with the things that we can't control. And if that's any benefit from what we've been experiencing since the middle of March, I think it's been that lesson. There's so much that we can't control. The question becomes, will we become angry? Will we become frustrated? Will we rage against the limitations in our lives? Or will we be at peace with the fact that God is in control and we're not? James continues in verse 8. He says, you too, be patient and stand firm like that farmer. What he's saying is this: Christianity and the Christian life is not about conquering. It is not about taking control. It is about endurance. It's about waiting. It's about patience. The heroes of the Christian faith, whether you read about them in Hebrews chapter 11 or whether you read about it in Revelation, what you always see is the overcomers are the one who patiently endure suffering while waiting with hope for the coming of Jesus Christ. And here is how James put it. He says, you too, be patient and stand firm. Why? Because the Lord's coming is near. And I'm sure some of you are saying, oh, wait a second. He said 2,000 years ago that the Lord's coming is near. That is not near. We've been waiting all for millennia, and Jesus still has not come. But here's what God's calling us to do and what James is pointing out to us. If we're going to live with patience, we need to begin to see the world from God's perspective. How does God see our lives? Well, we see our lives as like maybe 80, 90, maybe even 100 years long. But God sees our life because he stands outside of time as a mere vapor. It's like the flower or the grass that springs up in the morning and by evening after a long hot day is gone. That's how God sees us. What is 80, 90, or 100 years in comparison to God's eternity? Or even 3,000 years? God is calling us to see the world from his perspective. And from his perspective, the coming of the Lord is near. What is he trying to tell us? He's trying to tell us that, yes, your present suffering or your present limitation or this coronavirus or this upheaval in this country, that is your present reality. He's not asking you to deny it. But even though it's our present reality, because the Lord's coming is near, our present reality is not our forever reality. Our forever reality is Christ and his kingdom and our place in it, and living in a world without sin, without pain, without suffering, without crying, without sorrow, without mourning. That is our future reality. That is our forever reality. And when we see the world from God's perspective, we begin to see that this is present. It's very real, but it's not forever. And so God calls us to look at the world from his perspective, to look at time from his perspective. But he also, as we look at the world through God's perspective, we also gain a new understanding of what the word blessed means. If we're honest with ourselves, our gut level definition of what blessed really means is when we go through a period of smooth sailing in our life. Job's going well, we're blessed. The kids are doing well, we're blessed. Our marriage is improving, we're blessed. But that's not how God sees blessing. From his perspective, this is what blessing is. If you look down at verse 11, James writes this: as you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. Did you catch the difference? Blessing is not freedom from struggle. It is God giving you the power to endure through struggle. That's blessing. It is not the power to avoid pain. It is the power to remain hopeful and to be perseverant through pain. Those who endure, those who hang on, those who do not give up, those are the ones who are truly blessed. What it means is this, is that there is no struggle, there is no pain, there is nothing in this world that can deny the fact that we are beloved and blessed by God. And James holds out two more examples. We've already seen the farmer. Now he's going to see, here's what blessed looks like. And he holds out to us the prophets and a man named Job. Now, the prophets were not someone or a job that you would ever want if you were a Jewish kid growing up back then. It was an incredibly difficult job. The job of a prophet was to be a messenger of God, but he never came during good times. You see, God had established a special relationship with Israel called the covenant, where God had promised to be their people, to be their God, to protect them, to love them, to bless them. They are his prized possession. But because God has brought these people into his family through a covenant, it's almost like a marriage. God also had expectations for his people Israel. This is what it looks like for you to live as members of my family. You're to follow the 10 Commandments. You're to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and you're to love your neighbor as yourself. And loving your neighbor as yourself includes the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner, the most vulnerable among you. And the prophets came when the people of Israel were not living up to the terms of their covenant. When they were not keeping the 10 Commandments, when they were not loving God, when they were not loving their neighbor, and they were there to warn them of God's judgment if they didn't repent, which you can imagine made them incredibly unpopular. They were ridiculed, they were mocked, they were arrested, they were beaten. Many of them were killed. But yet James holds them out as people who are blessed. They're blessed not because of their suffering, but because God gave them the power to endure, and they are now in the presence of God because they were faithful to him, and God was faithful to them despite their suffering. James tells us that the prophets were the ones that are the example to us. And he also holds out for us Job. He says, you've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. For those of you who are not familiar with Job's story, Job was a man who was righteous, a man who walked with God, and God had blessed him with a large family, lots of children, and lots of wealth. But in order to demonstrate that Job did not love God simply for the things that God had given him, God allowed Job to lose it all. He lost his family in one day. He lost his wealth in one day. And he lost his health. He was covered with sores, with boils from head to toe. And his wife urged him just to give up and to curse God and die. And Job refused. He persevered. He believed that there was a Redeemer out there who lived, that despite the fact that his life was in shambles, he still believed that God had a future for him, and he never gave up on that. But the fact that Job was hopeful, that he looked into the future and saw that there was something that he could hold on to, did not mean that he was blind to what he was experiencing in the present. What I love about Job and what I love about the prophets is that they argue with God. And they're incredibly honest about what they're experiencing. This is what Job tells God in Job chapter 6. That's if I actually find it. Oh, I'm not looking in the right spot here. So Job chapter 6, he tells God this. He says, if only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. What you see in Job's patience is a radical and a deep commitment to honesty. He is not sugarcoating what he's experiencing. He's acknowledging his present reality. God has stricken him, and he argues with God, and he wrestles with God. That's what patience looks like. Patience is not denial. Patience is not whitewashing our situation and saying it's all good. Patience is being honest about who we are and what we're experiencing in this moment, arguing with God, bringing our honesty to God, allowing him to know how we feel, wrestling with God, but not letting go of the fact that there is a future hope and promise that God has. James tells us that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. You see, he points our attention not only to Job's perseverance, but also to what God brought about at the end. And I love how the book of Job ends. You can find this in chapter 40. The writer says, at the end of Job's life, God blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first, which means that God had restored everything that he had lost. His family was bigger, his wealth was bigger. But some of you are saying, yeah, but he still lost those kids. And yes, there's a limitation to that story because it's talking about this life. But Job's life pattern is a pattern for us as we contemplate our eternity. No matter where we are in our life, no matter how difficult life gets, no matter even if we're on our deathbed and we're facing terminal cancer, it doesn't matter. We can always say that I am blessed in the presence because God is giving me the power to endure. But I also know that God will bless me more in the future. That's what patience looks like. Knowing that God has given me the strength today, I am blessed in this moment. But it also hopes in the future that God will give me the power to hold on, and one day I will be blessed even more than I am now. Before we close, I just wanted to say that I would have blown the sermon if I had forgotten to mention the ultimate example of patience. And that ultimate example of patience is Jesus. The writer of Hebrews is writing to a community of Jews who, like James, had become followers of Jesus. But life had become so difficult for them that they were considering giving up and just going back to their old way of life. And this whole book was written to encourage them to cling to Jesus. And in verse 2 of chapter 12, he urges them to do this. He says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Who is the ultimate symbol of patience? It's Jesus. There's this scene the night before Jesus is killed, where he is wrestling with God the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's so intense in his prayer, and he's so distressed that sweat is pouring off his body like drops of blood dripping on the ground. And he even says to God, he's not denying what he's experiencing. He's saying, my soul is overwhelmed even to the point of death. He's not sugarcoating, he's honest. But his patience endures as God allows him to endure. His Father allows him. And then he makes this incredible act of courageous patience, of endurance. He says, Father, if you could take this cup from me. He's under no illusions about what he's about to experience on the cross. But not my will, but yours be done. And the next day, Jesus went to the cross. And the writer of Hebrews says we're to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author, the creator of our faith, and the finisher of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured or patiently endured the cross. Why? What did he see in the future? Well, he saw his present reality. He saw his suffering, but he also looked to this future that God would create through his sacrifice on the cross. He saw heaven and earth brought together. He saw a new heaven and a new earth. He saw God living forever with his redeemed people. He saw us in the presence of God, enjoying him and worshiping forever. And that vision of the future was so beautiful and so magnificent to Jesus that the joy overwhelmed him, that it gave him the power to endure in this moment. That is the source of patience. You see, when you're struggling with patience, and I know that all of us are right now, look to Jesus who was patient for you. Because when he was nailed to the cross, he was nailed to the cross for all the sins that we've committed out of impatience, all the sin that we committed out of the fact that we feel entitled. He died for all the sins that we committed because we need to be in control. It was all nailed to the cross, and it's gone. He was patient for us. And as we receive his mercy and his grace, the Lord is compassionate and full of mercy, as James tells us. And we experience that through Jesus. As we receive that mercy, we give that mercy. As we receive that compassion, we give that compassion. Because one of James's most concerning things that he thought about as he thought about this church, and he thought about communities in general when they're under stress, is that when we're stressed out and when our lives are disrupted and we're feeling impatient, that's when conflict happens. And he says in verse 9, don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge, who is Jesus, is standing at the door. As we experience God's patience for us, I pray that Jesus will give us the strength to be patient with each other. Even during a time when our lives are completely disrupted, may God grant us extra grace. Take some time. There's a discussion guide called Going Deeper. You can find a link to it on pacificunionchurch.org/church-small. Or you can find a link to it in the description of this video. But follow that guide. What is God teaching you? What are you hearing from God about patience? How is God challenging you specifically to live patiently? Really think through how you're going to live this message out. And how can you share what you're learning with others? Really take some time to meditate on Jesus, who is patient for us, and how we might walk in his footsteps. Take care, and God bless you all.